Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel, where in our last episode we looked at the founding of the church and the response that Jesus got from Peter. And we need to just sort of look at that for a moment in order to go into chapter 17 and see the big response that Jesus gives to Peter. So I just want to summarize in a few words what happened there. Jesus asked the apostles, did they recognize him? And Peter said, yes, I know who you are. You're the Messiah and you're the Son of God. So Peter says, you are our Messiah. You are the Son of God. And Jesus said, and you are my Peter. So here we have a moment of mutual recognition. And very quickly, that moment of mutual recognition turns into a moment of repulsion. Because Peter says no to the suffering and the cross. And Jesus says no to that kind of Peter. So this is a bit of a shock. One minute they are completely together, and then the next minute they are repudiating each other, both of them. And so Jesus had to explain to them the importance of the way that God, in his infinite wisdom, had decided to redeem us. And that was to take the suffering of the human race and to redeem it completely so that it could become life-giving for us all, because there was no way any of us could avoid suffering. So, in this context, it is very necessary for Jesus to reveal himself to the apostles in a completely new way. And it's at this point you discover that there's an inner ring in the apostles, that Jesus had a very special apostle that we call John, that Matthew doesn't deal with, but that comes out very strongly in John's Gospel. And so there is this one, and then around that there is three, a ring of three, Peter, James, and John. And then you have the other apostles, and then you have the other disciples. Now, if you think of that as a Caesar and a Senate and a government, then you have the picture. Because Jesus is the emperor or the king, and John is the one who is closest to him, and then you have his most important ministers, and then you have the other layer, and then you have the other layer. So Jesus takes the three most important witnesses, Peter, James, and John, and he wanted these three to witness all his ministry, to witness his glory on Mount Tabor, to witness his agony and his decision to redeem the human race in Gethsemane, to witness his sacrifice, and to witness his triumph. Now, they weren't around for it all. And the reason why they weren't around for it all was that Peter is the spokesman for the others. And when Peter speaks up, he isn't actually just giving his own opinion. He's actually giving the thinking of the whole group. And here you've got Matthew already presenting what we call the Pope position, the one who speaks for the whole church, the one who represents the whole church before the Lord, and who represents the whole church before the people. And so he manages to put into words what is actually going on in the group. So it was Peter representing the others that said, no, we're not having any suffering. Glory, yes, no suffering. And so Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and he takes them to a place where he can reveal his divinity to them. And this is absolutely essential. He only reveals it to the three of them. And you might ask, why not the others? Well, if he brings in all the others, he has a major problem, and that is that Judas would be present. And Judas would take what would happen on Mount Tabor, the Christian Sinai. Judas would take that in a very wrong way. And Jesus chooses only these three, and they will reveal it to the others when Judas is gone. later at the time of the church. So 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain. Now, he led them up Mount Tabor. Which, according to our way of thinking, is not a high mountain, but if you have to climb it, it is. And if you have to climb it without any paths, which they did, it's a high mountain. But for us who can go halfway up in a bus and the other way in a taxi, it's not a high mountain. But they didn't have that kind of transport. And he wanted to be alone with them. Now here you have a lot of things in this text, and one of them is that if you want to serve the Lord, if you want to do something for him on this earth, he wants you every now and then to come away alone with him so that he can reveal himself to you. And the more we know him, the more we can work for him, the more we can explain him to others. The less we know him, the less we can do for him, and the less we can explain him to others. So it was to come into this intimacy with God that he wanted Peter, James, and John. And in their presence, he was transfigured.
While he was praying, his face changed in its appearance, and his clothes became dazzling white.
Now, Luke will tell you that Jesus went into prayer himself, and it was during the prayer that he was transfigured. Matthew is not dealing with that. Matthew just wants to get to the point that Jesus was transfigured. The word that he's actually using means changed in form. And Psalm 104 verse 2 says, Lord, you are clothed in majesty, you are wrapped in a robe of light. And this is what they're trying to describe here, that all of a sudden they saw Jesus wrapped in a robe of light. Now that's exactly how they're going to see him after the resurrection. So here you're going to get a preview of the resurrection. They have huge problems with the redemption that Jesus is going to bring about. And so Jesus has to give them the first sign of his glory. And you're going to hear them saying, John puts it in his gospel very clearly, we saw his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son of God, full of grace and truth. Well, it's here that they saw it for the first time, and then what they saw here was confirmed in the resurrection. So Matthew says his face shone like the sun. So here you've got the glory of God coming through him. And his clothes were as white as the light. So he's transformed into light. Okay. And St. John, in his first letter, 1 John 1:5, says, God is light. So here the divinity is being manifested to them. Now, if you've ever been very close to a person who is deep in prayer, I didn't say praying, I said deep in prayer. And I mean really in contact with God at a deep level. If you're even physically close to that person, sitting beside them, you'll be drawn into it. Because the glow of that experience will be so strong that it will affect anybody around. And this is what happened to Peter, James, and John. They are drawn into this experience. Their eyes are opened, their ears are opened, and they begin to see and hear things that were totally impossible to them up to now. And they saw Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. Now, Jesus didn't need this vision for himself. It was not necessary for him, but it sure was necessary for them, because they have acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah and indeed as the Son of God. But do they know what they're talking about? Because in the Psalms you read, all of you, have I not said, all of you are sons of the Most High, according to the covenant, you see. So Son of God didn't necessarily mean divine. And so the vision that the apostles are having is necessary in order to open up to them the reality of who Jesus is. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them.
They were Moses and Elijah who appeared in heavenly glory.
And they were talking with Jesus.
You will fulfill God's purpose.
You will die in Jerusalem.
And poor Peter can't wait. One of his problems is that he speaks before he thinks. It's very important to think before you speak. Peter spoke to Jesus in the middle of this. Wouldn't you think they'd wait and try and take it on board? Did Peter know what he was looking at? Moses represents the law, Elijah represents the prophets. Both Moses and Elijah had a personal experience of God on Mount Sinai, or Horeb was the other name for Mount Sinai, and both of them received a very important message for the people of God. And so together they represent everything that God has said and done up to now. And the apostles see them bowing before Jesus. In other words, giving way to him, because he is the fulfillment of the scriptures. He is the divine word incarnate. They only managed to get whatever they could possibly get from God, but he is the divine word incarnate. And so it is actually Luke that tells you what they were discussing. And Luke uses the word exodus. They were discussing Jesus' exodus. In other words, they were discussing the Passover in which Jesus would redeem the human race through suffering. So the apostles hear Moses and Elijah discussing this with Jesus. They should have been on their knees listening utterly intently, saying, we got it wrong. The scriptures have already told us that this has to happen to the Messiah. We have to submit to this. We need to open up to this. They don't do anything like that. They jump in headlong. And Peter said, Lord, he said, it's good for us to be here. It's all glory and heavenly and wonderful here. Never mind that dismal via crucis that you're talking about. We don't want the suffering bit. We don't mind staying here. And then completely misunderstanding his own role as the leader. But he's only leader when Jesus is gone. He said, I will make 3 tents for you.
As they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus,
Master, how good it is that we are here. We will make 3 tents.
Now, if this is an examination paper, that's 0 out of 10. 0. You've missed the point completely. I will make 3 tents here, 1 for you, 1 for Moses, and 1 for Elijah. Oops, they're all equal. And Peter has completely forgotten what Jesus said in chapter 16, verse 18. I will build my church. Peter is not building the church. It's not his business to build the church. Jesus alone can build his church. And Peter is the one that he has put in to administer the church for him. But he's not the builder. He's not the author. And here is Peter stepping up to his own great importance. I will build 3 tents for you. The scandalous thing is that if you go to Mount Tabor today, there is a church built for Jesus, and in the back there are 2 chapels, 1 to Moses and 1 to Elijah. I call it a monument to disobedience. We don't get the message. We don't let God say what he wants to say. They were being told that Jesus is the one who is supereminent and that these others were simply servants of God. He is the Lord. And even with seeing it and hearing, they still don't get the message. What do you do if they don't get the message at all? And so very, very seldom does God, the Father, intervene in the human race, and he intervenes now. Because the only way to shut Peter and the others up and to make them listen and learn as distinct from doing things the way they want to do them themselves, the only way to do that is to come. And so Matthew says, while he was still speaking, that's what I mean that God has to shut him up. While he was still speaking, The bright cloud, the Shekinah, the ineffable presence of God, covered them.
As Peter spoke,
One for
a
you,
cloud came and overshadowed
one
them,
for Moses,
and the disciples were
and one
afraid.
for Elijah.
Now, to be covered by this shadow means that the ineffable presence of God has come upon you. In the Bible, the cloud is one of the favorite images of God in his mysterious, ineffable presence, because if you look at a cloud in the sky, the cloud both allows the light to come through, but it also conceals the sun from you. And so the cloud represents mystery. It tells you that the Lord is present, but you can't see him, you're not allowed to see him. And so when they're overshadowed by the cloud, it means that the cloud has come right down onto the ground. I don't know if this has ever happened to you. It has happened to me once in a weather situation in Canada, that a cloud came right down to the ground, covering us completely. All traffic had to stop. And there was warnings on the highway, traffic, stop wherever you are. Just stop. Don't move. Because nobody could see where they were going. Because the cloud actually stops you. And you have to pay attention. It was a wonderful experience for me, and I said, wow, this is the cloud overshadowing us. And so in this cloud, the apostles know exactly what to do now. This is the ineffable presence of God, so they throw themselves on the ground in prostration, which is correct. And then the voice of God the Father speaks to them. So this is the Christian Sinai. They're up the mountain, they're seeing visions, they are hearing the voice of God, they get a message from God. That's the Christian Sinai. Moses had gone up a mountain, Mount Sinai, and entered into the presence of God. The cloud came upon him, he received a message from God. Elijah the same. Here we have Peter, James, and John. They're having exactly the same experience. And when God the Father spoke to them, they heard his voice, didn't see his form. That was exactly the same way as Moses and Elijah. That's why this is called the Christian Sinai, because all the circumstances are the same. And God said, "This is my Son. He's the beloved. He enjoys my favor. Listen to him."
And a voice came from the cloud, saying, "This is my Son, the chosen one. Listen to him."
That was quite a rebuke from God the Father. You're to no longer listen to Moses and Elijah. You've shifted into a completely new era. You're to listen to my Son. He is the leader. He is the author. He is the maker of the church. He is the word. He is the message. It's his kingdom. It's his power. It's his glory. It's his everything. Let him do what he needs to do. Listen to him. And so that became the great action of guidance for the church. Listen to him. And so while we will learn the lessons that are there for us in abundance from the Old Testament, Jesus is the Word, and he's the one we listen to. He's the one we follow. So listen to him. So when they heard this, the disciples fell on their faces, overcome with fear, naturally. Peter had been rebuked by Jesus at the end of chapter 16, but to be rebuked by God the Father is a different matter altogether, because they were seeing Jesus in the flesh. But now they realize that God the Father and God the Son were saying the same thing. The way to redeem the human race is through suffering. There is no other way, because you're dealing with a broken humanity. And so they were still completely overcome, and they didn't even realize that the cloud had lifted and that God had stopped speaking. They were so overcome with the whole thing. And Matthew says Jesus actually physically touched them. Now, what Matthew is trying to say is Jesus has to heal them. He has got to raise them up. They are prostrate. They're not going to be able to continue unless Jesus actually heals them. He's got to heal their way of thinking. He's got to heal their way of speaking. He's got to heal their way of doing. He's got to heal their way of life. He's got to heal everything. He is the Redeemer. And so healing of the body is nothing to the healing that needs to take place inside of us and the transformation that needs to take place inside of us. This is the beginning of the transformation of Peter and James and John. And their transformation will be very slow. But if you go to 2 Corinthians 3:18, St. Paul tells us that the more we contemplate the glory of God, the more the glory of God comes to us. And that we end up being transformed into the image that we reflect. And so the whole process of living the Christian life is a transformation from what we were to what we must be. And we must be a whole new creature in Christ, as Paul tells us. So this is the beginning of their transformation. And when they looked up, Jesus said, "Stand up and don't be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw nobody but Jesus only. Now, the last statement isn't as dramatic in Matthew as it is in the other Gospels, particularly Luke. In other words, they were back to ordinariness. They saw Jesus in his ordinary way. They just saw him as a young man. He was not transfigured anymore. His clothes were not glowing with light anymore. So they're back to normality, to ordinariness. And we all feel very comfortable. No matter how great a spiritual experience is, we have a great need to come back to ordinariness, to everyday life. And so when they're coming down from the mountain, the apostles realize if the Old Testament era is coming to an end, if Jesus is inaugurating a completely new era, then why didn't Elijah come back? Now, the strange thing is that back in chapter 11, Jesus talked to them about Elijah, but they didn't really hear the significance of it. It's only now with this experience that they have that they realize the significance of it. And so as they came down the mountain, he gave them the order, "Tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man is risen from the dead." Now, one of the people that mustn't be told is Judas, because he'll create terrible trouble for them. But he tells them to just keep quiet about his divinity, because it's only in the passion that they will discover he's divine. Isn't that incredible? You would expect the exact opposite, but it is actually in the passion that they discover he's divine. And so the disciples said to him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah has got to come first?" "True," Jesus said, "Elijah is to come first so that everything is put in order. However, I tell you, Elijah has already come, and he should have said, none of you recognized him. And they treated him as they pleased. And the Son of Man will suffer in the same way as he has suffered." And then the disciples understood that he was talking about John the Baptist. Now, if you go back to chapter 11, where Jesus talked to them about John the Baptist and how important he was, there he actually told them very clearly, but they hadn't heard it. And so he says in 11:14, "If you would believe me," he said, "he is the Elijah who was to return." Because he explained John the Baptist and his importance and his ministry and everything there. And so this is a lesson that is being repeated because they haven't heard it before. Now, what has happened to Jesus on Mount Sinai is one of the Mosaic signs, because Moses went up the mountain at the time of the Exodus 34, and he spent 40 days on the mountain. Jesus didn't need to even spend 40 minutes. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain prayer and fasting. And then he came down from the mountain absolutely transfigured. And he was so transfigured that even Aaron was scared looking at him. And Moses had to cover his face because the people couldn't look at the glory that was all over him. In other words, that if you go deeply into the presence of God, even other people who may know nothing about prayer know there's something about you that is absolutely different, okay? And they may only say it that way. There's something different about him or about her. And so the transfiguration that happens to us in prayer is actually essential to the whole Christian experience. I'll continue this reflection in our next segment. Thank you for joining us. Slán agus Beannacht Dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
It's a great joy for me to endorse Shalom World TV. I was delighted to hear that they were going to be based in Portlaoise in our diocese, in a studio there in the parish, to base their Irish operation. I'm delighted to welcome the Shalom team. They will be invaluable partners for the Meeting of the World Meeting of Families when we host it in Dublin in 2018. And they will be a marvellous tool to deepen the evangelization and the spreading of the good news around our country. The greatest challenge today for all of us in faith is communication. Communicating the message and doing it well. I thank Shalom for making their contribution to the world of media and their contribution to allowing the good news to be heard to the ends of the earth. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit bless all who work in Shalom and all who watch their stations. May St. Bridget accompany you on your journey. May St. Conleth be with you and St. Lazarian stay beside you. Amen.
Shalom World, God's own channel.